Hi, everybody. This is the third part of a three-part series that I have uploaded onto my blog on my website, www.lisamorrison.co.uk. And I am just going to start reading. Sometimes people find it easier to have a video for these issues. So the following three-part blog arose after agreeing to be interviewed about my experiences of receiving electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, by the BBC Northern Ireland. The purpose is to share my views, experiences, and questions arising from facing the reality that I had far more courses of ECT than I remembered. And I've also since received some of my notes, my records from when I was in hospital, which I'd requested because of my sketchy memory. These validated issues I have raised through my work, but were quite challenging and at times distressing to read. This is a bog standard reflection on my thoughts on ECT and the system in which it was delivered, as I try to make sense of my own journey through mental health services. It's helped me take what felt overwhelming and too big and translate it into a narrative, which I hope will contribute to some kind of positive change. I have not tried to give multiple perspectives or make lots of references in it. This is just my story. I intentionally refer to the system and not individuals, as I believe, in my experience, in the most part, people wanted to help. This is part 3, and it's called Justice and Hope. I'm going to be talking about women, ECT, and the mental health system as a wider issue. I'm going to put a trigger warning in this one that I talk about suicide, self-harm, and rape. I also just want to say, when I make these videos and all my work, I always have things to help me ground and regulate. So I have my candle, I have some precious objects. I sometimes just hold something in my hand, barefoot, feet on the ground, can really help when, talking about what can be difficult issues. So I suppose this one for me is particularly personal. So I just share that. Why are approximately 70% of people who get ECT women? One reason I assume is that more women than men suffer with major depression. Why is this? I'm sure there is research out there, but in this blog, I'm just really thinking out loud. The devastating prevalence of domestic violence, rape, and murder, and the unimaginable treatment of women in countries like Afghanistan and even my own home country, South Africa, has flooded the news this year, and there is a palpable increase in outrage about violence against women and girls. Many organizations established in a patriarchy and based on misogynistic attitudes still hold in some ways some of these deeply entrenched beliefs. Male entitlement and privilege are still very real. Conviction rates for rape are lower than any other crime, and we know that an overwhelming majority, I think it's 91%, are committed by men. The mental health system is no different. In the late 19th, early 20th century, some of the reasons women were committed to asylums were not fulfilling wifely duties. I definitely would have been committed. Mr. Morrison is sitting here. I was committed anyway, I guess, but reading novels, imaginary female troubles, and studying. We've been labeled with hysteria and being demon-possessed, burnt at the stake and sectioned, locked away and tortured for years in asylums. I am not a scholar in this area, but there is plenty of literature out there verifying this. Despite the seemingly enlightened nature of the age we live in, I fear that the current psychiatric system continues to silence and blame women in a more insidious but equally harmful way. Why do so many abused and traumatized women get the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, BPD, and EUPD, emotionally unstable personality disorder? I think they kind of just different words used. The symptoms and diagnostic criteria could apply to anyone with those experiences. This is a highly contentious diagnosis and sometimes referred to as a diagnosis of exclusion because of some of the very poor and harmful attitudes towards and treatment of people with this label. I talk about my many diagnoses in part 2 of this 3-part blog and discuss how complex post-traumatic stress and dissociative disorder were diagnosed. My question remains, why did it take so long for this to happen for me? When I first saw a psychiatrist, was prescribed medication and diagnosed with major depression at the age 14, we, and I mean the world over, believed and were told that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. Very convenient for the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. Some people still believe this to be true, and I've included at the end of this a piece about that. We do now know that trauma has a broad range of effects on brain structure and function, and equally neuroplasticity means that they can be repaired. Dr. Bruce Perry, MD, PhD, and you can look him up, states, relationships are the agents of change and the most powerful therapy is human love. He also says in one of his quotes, relationships matter. The currency for systemic change was trust, and trust comes through forming healthy working relationships. People, not programs, change people. Separating mind and body, physical and emotional, and ignoring the environments and conditions in which people live and work is absurd. Here I'm simplifying a complex area, but I did feel it was important to reference in the context of this piece. So I'm going to share with you just one incident of many, which I feel illustrates some of the issues and questions I've raised over all 3 blogs. In doing this, I broaden my focus now from the initial part of this piece. In March 2014, on a Sunday, I was raped and very badly beaten. The day after, I told my community psychiatric nurse, who took me to the Rowan, a pioneering sexual assault referral unit center for Northern Ireland. On the Tuesday, I was interviewed by the police, and after this, I took a taxi alone to the psychiatric inpatient unit. It had been a difficult decision to decide to report. I held a great deal of shame and self-blame. During my 7-week stay as an inpatient, I went through 2 police video interviews, had to revisit the scene of the crime, and have my injuries photographed at the police station. My marriage had broken up the year before. My family were all in South Africa, and I had been dismissed from my job, understandably, due to years of poor mental health. My psychiatrist had written in the report in 2013 to the occupational health doctor, limited prognosis for recovery. There were, of course, also the past untreated traumas, some of which services knew about, which were understandably triggered. Yet in my notes, any self-harm or heightened distress was put down to my then diagnosis of EUPD. It was no wonder that I attempted suicide again and ended up in ICU on life support. I was readmitted to the inpatient unit for a week each between July and August, during which time I had numerous visits to the emergency department. Article 3 of the Human Rights Act 1998 is freedom from torture and inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. I had mixed experiences in the emergency department, but lack of privacy and dignity when getting stitched on my stomach and inner thigh, alongside some very ignorant attitudes about self-harm, were re-traumatizing. A doctor refused to give anesthetic, and I felt too ashamed and undeserving to say I really needed it. Needing internal and external stitching after waiting 6, 8, 10 hours to be seen means the initial endorphins have worn off. Consequences like not being allowed out to see my son on his birthday because I had self-harmed the day before were enforced. I was readmitted in September 2014 for nearly 10 weeks. My notes report I was apparently happy to get ECT again. Well, why wouldn't I be? Anesthetic provided momentary but desperately needed relief from what felt like unbearable madness in my head and deep despair and hopelessness in the core of me. There was little else being offered. I had been cycling in and out of hospital since 2009. Writing this, I feel a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and anger. Trauma for me was about total powerlessness, a fear that I can't begin to describe, and a shame that permeated every cell in my being. What was so badly wrong with me that I had visited all these things upon myself? The mental health system reinforced how wrong I was and took away my power with a doing to medicalised approach. And yet I couldn't survive without them. I was alone and confused, desperate and hopeless. I wanted to die, but I also didn't. The quantity and variety of medications that I was on can only be described as a chemical lobotomy. It was hard just to function. The ignorance in telling those on high doses of psychiatric medications just to eat healthily, exercise, take more responsibility, and get motivated. Perhaps you should try functioning on the high doses of medications that I and many other people have been on. What really troubles and saddens me is that most staff were kind. I know people who get their notes and are further damaged by reading the language that has been used to describe them. I'm fortunate that this wasn't the case in mine. I had the most committed and reliable CPN who I knew really cared. The shock in reading my notes was the very clear signs, which I've since learnt about, that I was traumatized and dissociated, and it wasn't recognized. Year in and year out, the same conversations were had. The medications changed and increased, and I drifted further and further away from life. I was slowly dying, and no pill was going to fix that. A man raped me. I pleaded for him to stop at one point. I thought he was going to murder me, and then I'd wished he had. Another layer of trauma on top of many. It never got to court, but if it had, Article 10 of the Mental Health Northern Ireland Order 1986 would mean that I had a legal duty to declare that I had been detained on a number of occasions. How would this further have discredited me as a witness to a crime with notoriously low conviction rates and all the myths surrounding it? Where does my human right not to be discriminated against sit with this? As a woman and as someone who would be seen as having a disability. Did I need an electric current penetrating my brain for the 4th time in 4 years, rendered powerless, told to engage in some positive thinking? I needed wrapped in a soft blanket with a warm mug of milk and reassured that I was safe and that everything was okay. I needed somebody to teach me how to regulate, to calm my overloaded nervous system, to explain that my responses were completely normal in the light of what had happened, that although it didn't feel like it, with the right support, it wouldn't always feel like this. to be reassured that it was normal for past traumas to be triggered, but that I wouldn't be walking this journey alone. These things can only happen in relationship, where people understand the impact of trauma and aren't afraid to show up with their own humanity. I was relatively well when I began seeing my therapist last year, but I needed and continue to need her and others teaching and reminding me of how to return my nervous system to safe and connected. It takes time, practice, and consistent support and repetition. It's hard work. And we all need this to varying degrees. It affects all of us. Our organizations need to be trauma-informed and responsive for everybody. How do we expect dysregulated staff to help dysregulated, distressed people? The challenge is that unless people can afford private therapy, the number of therapy sessions, where they are even offered, are usually hopelessly inadequate, which can cause further harm. And too often, there are no options or choices for what that therapy will be. What I needed could be different for somebody else. Yet we offer people a therapy for a limited time, and when they inconveniently don't get better, the blame and shame is reinforced, and the problem once more located within the individual. The individual is one cog in a larger wheel. Person-centered care. Yes, I needed to take ownership of my healing and put in the work. But what were the options and the choices at the time? And what were my social circumstances and history? Building trust takes time, especially when at the center of traumatic events is betrayal of the most devastating kind. Recognizing and believing in the inherent strengths within each person is so important. Holding hope. When nurtured and gently tended to, it can grow and flourish. A quality and meaningful life needs defined by the individual. It doesn't necessarily mean the absence of challenges, or dare I use the word symptoms. But what are the standards we set for people? A report at the end of that horrific year stated that I had a history of poor coping skills. What I had was a history of abuses perpetrated against me. I wasn't disordered. What happened to me was. We need to stop blaming, shaming, and labeling people. Getting access to the right help in a timely manner is only one part of the puzzle. Therapy isn't for everyone, and some people find help in peer support groups, art groups, other things. Lots of things are useful, and we need lots of things. What I do believe is there needs to be a focus on building more connected, cohesive communities. And communities, I mean, in all their forms, not just what we traditionally think about of as the neighborhoods we live in. And they need to have autonomy to collectively decide what they need and how best to make it accessible. Government needs held to account for funding without all the conditions, legalities, fear of relinquishing power, and mistrust that create such barriers to doing this. Where do we hope to be in 10, 20 years? The current system is unsustainable. Relationships heal and change lives. Building our tribes in such a way that we'll feel safe, a true sense of belonging, accepted, and connected. This is so needed. Healing for me is a journey. Quite extraordinary in many ways. Also painful and really hard work. I've been learning to see the world through a new lens. And as I grow, so too does my curiosity. I share my experiences and thoughts, but there are many and varied views and perspectives. Imagine if we could meet respectfully to really hear and learn from each other. My husband and I were reunited 3 years ago. He is my solid place. We laugh like those newly in love because we know how precious and fragile life is. I can hold my beautiful children close and feel their hearts beating. They have learned a kindness through these years, and I am just so proud of the young adults they are growing into. I have a therapist who understands how the body remembers and the role and function of dissociation. She is teaching me in a very human way to find new ways of making sense of and telling my story. I am seen, heard, and accepted in my totality. My friend walks alongside, offering a space of grace and love where I can rest and laugh with abandon. I'm slowly growing my business and doing my heart's work. I've been given another chance at life, and for this I'm so very grateful. It isn't perfect, whose is? But I was lucky to get to the treatment center in South Africa, my family chipping together so I could afford to go. Coming back and having the opportunity through the recovery college to go back to the work I always loved. To finally get the therapy which was right for me and good friends and colleagues in my life. Everybody deserves another chance at life. Everybody needs seen as the unique individual they are, not simply a diagnosis to be treated. I too can get stuck in all that is wrong. But when my focus changes to just the next step, it all seems more doable. Every encounter is an opportunity to make a difference, however small. What kind of difference are you going to make today? Appendix 1. What do I mean by trauma-informed and responsive? I refer to trauma-informed and trauma-responsive in these blogs, but believe that this is a word we can bandy about with little context. When thinking about this, I often refer to the work of Dr. Karen Treisman, clinical psychologist, trainer, and author, who teaches about trauma-informed organizational culture with the following principles and values in her book, A Treasure Box for Creating Trauma-Informed Organizations, Volume 1, 2021. And I have to say as well that I reference Dr. Treisman because she truly models what she teaches on all the platforms that she's on, and such humility. Safety and trust, relationships, connections, and humanizing services, curiosity, reflectiveness, empathy, compassion, and understanding, strengths, hope, and resilience, cultural humility and responsiveness, agency, mastery, choice, and voice, communication, collaboration, and transparency. Dr. Treisman also covers the very broad range of what is meant by trauma. These are the values and principles I refer to when using those terms. They were very much modeled in my relationship with BBC Northern Ireland journalist Niall McCracken. Given how much poor practice I have experienced when bringing my lived experience to various platforms, I felt it was a good opportunity to highlight what I believe to be good practice. So Appendix 2, good practice, trauma-informed values and principles in action. I want to thank Niall for the way I felt he honored trauma-informed principles and values in many ways. At all points over the months that we spoke, I remained in charge of what I chose to share and had the power to decide at any point if I no longer wanted to participate. I was given background information about the content of the piece and was kept updated on any progress regularly. Everything was clearly explained, including the stages and way these pieces are progressed. Safety protocols were excellent in terms of ensuring I understood the extent that my information would be shared and the potential impact of this. I felt my well-being and not just my story was the priority, and valid inquiries were made for me to consider the impact on my family. This was not done in a paternalistic manner, and Niall saw beyond what would be considered my complex history. This could have been seen as a risk and affected whether or not someone was willing to trust that I was well and able enough to do the piece. Niall showed great humility and never presuming to know or understand in depth some of the issues I raised. He was open to learning and really listened. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations, but asked questions with sensitivity. I knew he really cared about the issue and the people affected. I felt heard and that my perspectives mattered. Whatever BBC Northern Ireland legal responsibilities are, it was the way in which Niall conducted himself and his genuine concern and interest that made me feel safe and able to trust him with something so deeply personal to me. How we are with people really matters. Thank you.